Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Maryland Native Plant Society's webinar, National Park Forests in the Eastern United States, Ecological Value and Natural Resource Challenges, with Dr. Liz Matthews of the National Park Service. I'm Ann DeNovo, and I'll be your host. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Liz Matthews, is an ecologist and program manager with the National Park Service Inventory and Monitoring Program, known as the I&M program. The I&M program conducts natural resource inventories of all of the national parks across the United States and monitors key vital signs or resource indicators to help provide information for resource management in the national parks. Liz first joined the I&M program in the National Capital Area in 2013 as a botanist, where she led forest vegetation monitoring program in 11 national parks in and around DC. Before joining the National Park Service, she studied plant phenology in national parks in California, and she also studied alluvial vegetation in the Piedmont region of North Carolina. And with that, Liz, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So good evening, everyone. Thanks for that intro, Anne. Thanks for having me here tonight to talk about the work that National Park Service ecologists are doing in the national park forests here in the DC area and beyond. Tonight, I'm going to share results from an ongoing long-term forest monitoring program, first focused on quantifying the ecological value of National Park Service forests, and second, talking about some of the challenges that National Park Service land managers face in managing these important resources. I'll start with a little bit of background. Anne touched on this briefly, but I work for the National Park Service Inventory and Monitoring Program, which conducts natural resource inventories and long-term monitoring of important ecosystems to help inform park management decisions. The National Park Service units that manage natural resources have been grouped into 32 networks, most of which are shown on the map in the colored shapes here. And these inventory and monitoring networks represent 270 National Park Service units across the US. The office I work for, the National Capital region here, and hopefully you can see my pointer hovering over that, is in the orange shape, and it represents 11 National Park Service units in and around DC. A core component of the National Park Service I&M program, or inventory monitoring, is vital signs monitoring, which tracks key natural resource indicators in the parks to assess the health of natural resources and to inform management. And in the National Capital Region I&M network, and for our parks, we monitor a modest set of natural resource vital signs, again, natural resource indicators, that provide information on the status, so a snapshot, and trends change over time, of water quality, landscape structure, biological integrity, and that includes forest vegetation, stream fish and macroinvertebrates, birds, and amphibians. And while vital sign indicators vary among the National Park Service I&M network, so the shapes that we saw on the previous map, most of the geographically nearby networks monitor similar natural resource indicators, primarily as a result of shared biogeography, shared climate, and geology. In our part of the world, all of the networks, basically from Virginia all the way up through Maine, monitor forest vegetation as a vital sign. That is likely unsurprising since most of these parks are forested land cover. There are 5 nearby networks near the National Capital Region network that collaborate closely on this forest vegetation vital sign. And the parks that are represented by these 5 networks are shown as single dots with their 4-letter acronyms on the map. The National Capital Region network, the network I work for here, is shown in yellow, and some of these parks may be familiar. So CATO or Cato is Catoctin Mountain Park, north of Frederick, Maryland. Ante is Antietam National Battlefield, Mono, Monocacy, and then in DC, Rock Creek. And there are probably others that are familiar to folks here tonight. There are many similarities among the parks of the National Capital Region network and our neighbors. For example, these parks tend to be smaller when compared to the Western counterparts, the big iconic national parks. And then many of these protect historical or cultural resources in addition to the natural resources that are protected by the parks. And in many cases, although not all, these parks are surrounded by highly developed or urbanized landscapes. To get a quick feel for the landscapes and resources that are protected by the Maryland and DC parks, I'll provide an overview of a few of the nearby parks for those who have not visited these protected areas. So starting with Catoctin Mountain Park, as I mentioned, which is north of Frederick, Maryland. It's a approximately 5,000 acre park in the Blue Ridge Mountains, mostly second growth forests, protecting mixed deciduous hardwoods, which cover about 95% of the park land cover. Antietam National Battlefield is one of many parks in this part of the country that protects a mixed matrix of open spaces and primarily second growth forests. And in this case, the park reflects the landscape at the time of Civil War battles. Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park is a historical park in our network that follows the Potomac River from DC to Cumberland, Maryland, protecting substantial areas of the Potomac River floodplain and nearby uplands. And by nature of its long and linear geometry, it shares a land border with many different managers and land uses, ranging from the highly urbanized eastern section in Georgetown, DC, to extremely rural state forest in Western Maryland, and then everything in between. And finally, in DC, we have Rock Creek Park, which is unique in being a mostly forested park, but then surrounded by a highly urbanized landscape, in this case, the District of Columbia. And so in each of these 5 networks, National Park Service staff collaborate closely on methods, data collection, and analysis so that we can summarize and analyze forest vegetation data at larger spatial scales. Instead of looking at single parks or even single networks, we can ask questions and analyze data that cover Virginia up through Maine. And the monitoring program began in 2006. So at this point, we have approximately a 15-year data set for most parks in these 5 networks. Across the parks, there are approximately 1,500 permanent plots. So these are revisited on a regular cycle, and it takes 4 years to visit all 1,500 plots. And in these permanent plots, we record information on trees, saplings, shrubs, seedlings, vines, and forbs, coarse woody debris, forest pests and diseases, and exotic plants. And the ecologists from each of these networks have been collaborating for more than a decade at this point on data management and analysis. And one of the first comprehensive analyses we completed was aimed at quantifying the ecological value of National Park Service forests. And so this evening, again, I'm going to start by summarizing the findings of those efforts towards documenting ecological value. And then in the second part, I'm going to shift and talk about some of the natural resource challenges and the management actions that are underway to manage these important resources to maintain and enhance their value. So I'll first share some of the highlights from 2 studies published in 2016 and 2018 by our working group of National Park Service ecologists that represent those 5 I&M networks in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. And in this pair of studies, the citations are at the bottom here and will be shown again at the end. We set out to examine the value of National Park Service forests towards conservation in this part of the country. To do that, we compared forest structure and diversity in national park forests to their neighboring non-National Park Service forests. And we used 2 data sets. We looked at the National Park Service data that are collected inside the parks by the I&M programs, and then compared that to data collected by the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis data set that is collected outside of the park, so the FIA data set. To ensure that we were comparing apples to apples, we compared park level data to FIA data collected within the same ecological subsection. And an ecological subsection is basically the smallest mapped unit within an ecoregion, and the ecological subsection, by definition, shares similar climate, topography, geology, and soils, such that you would expect the same potential natural vegetation throughout the subsection. So in this example, We have Roosevelt Vanderbilt National Historic Site in New York. The I&M plots are shown in the green triangles. And then the non-Park Service forest and the plots that FIA collect are shown in the yellow circles. But again, all of the data is collected within the same ecological subsection, which is shown in the grayed area. And because we're comparing apples to apples in terms of similar climate, topography, geology, and soils, our expectation is that differences between the park and the matrix or the nearby forest should primarily be due to differences in management. So I'm going to share some of the highlights of this study. I'm not going to share all of the findings, but I'm going to walk you through this figure first because it looks like a lot, but each of the figures are set up in the same way. If you find yourself getting lost in the figure and you just want to focus on the take-home message, that's written up here at the top. So in this case, the take-home message for this figure is that National Park Service forests have more biomass than the neighboring their neighboring forests. In each of these figures, the x-axis shows the parks that were included in the study, and they are arranged by increasing latitude, where on the left-hand side of the x-axis, we have the most southern parks, and on the right-hand side, we have the most northern parks. Above each park is 2 dots. A yellow dot shows the value of the metric of question, which will be shown on the y-axis, and that's the value for the matrix forests or the nearby ecological subsection forests. And the green dot shows the value for the National Park Service forests. The lines around those dots are error bars, and they're important, but we're not going to focus on those tonight, primarily zeroing in on the dots themselves. If the park has an asterisk next to its name, it means that the value of the metric for the forest, National Park Service forest, and the matrix forest is statistically different. So one of them is statistically different than the other, and you'd have to know which one is higher by looking at the figure. So for this figure in particular, we're comparing live basal area between park forest and non-park forests. Live basal area is broadly a measure of biomass. Basal area, if you were to take a cross section of a given unit, in this case 1 hectare, which is approximately 2.5 acres, how much of that area is covered in cross section by woody material. And the values are shown here on the y-axis. So again, looking at Catoctin, we see that the value for the National Park Service forests is higher than the value for the matrix forests, and that difference is statistically significant. The forest and the park have more biomass, statistically significant more biomass than the non-National Park Service forests. And if you look across the figure, kind of taking a step back, you'll see that in most cases, the National Park Service forests score higher. They have a higher value for live basal area than the non-park forests. When we look in the literature for potential thresholds or values of actual values for this metric that are important, we find that there are a variety of studies that suggest that approximately 29 meters squared per hectare is an important value of live basal area. This is a value above which many old growth forests map. And you'll see that many of the parks on this figure actually have values for live basal area above that threshold of 29 meters squared per hectare. And while I wouldn't say that any of the park forests are old growth, in fact, we know they're not, they're mostly second growth forests, many of them are beginning to attain some of the structural attributes of older forest structure. And so for this next figure, again, it's set up in the exact same way, but now we're looking at big trees, the density of large trees. And specifically, we're looking at the number of live trees that are greater than or equal to 30 centimeters at diameter at breast height. So basically their diameter approximately 2 meters above the ground. And again, at a broad look, many of the green dots are above the yellow dots, suggesting that Park Service forests have more large trees than their counterpart forest within the ecological subsection. And again, using Catoctin as an example, we'll see that difference is pretty substantial and it is statistically significant. For this metric, the number of large trees, we also looked at the literature to see if we could identify thresholds that suggest something meaningful. And we found a few studies that identified values above which large trees are really impactful for bird communities. So in this case, one study suggested 80 stems per hectare was the threshold above which you begin to get a later stage or later successional stage bird community. And another study suggested that value was a little higher at 127 stems per hectare. All but a few of the parks are above the lower threshold, and many are above the higher threshold. The matrix forests, on the other hand, are much lower and in many cases substantially lower than that threshold needed to support a diverse bird community. And the final metric I'll show here is coarse woody debris volume. And coarse woody debris is a measure of the amount of dead wood on the forest floor. And again, here we see the pattern almost universally in this case is that National Park Service forests have more dead wood on the forest floor than their matrix counterparts. And again, looking in the literature, we find a value of coarse woody debris volume that is suggested to sustain a broad range of deadwood dependent taxa. And in this case, all but one of the parks are above that value, whereas matrix forests typically do not attain that minimum value to support a diverse community. And finally, in addition to looking at structure in these two papers, we also looked at tree diversity, comparing diversity in National Park Service forests to their matrix forests. We looked at a variety of diversity metrics, including richness, which is basically a count of the number of species in a given area, and a variety of evenness and dominance metrics, which tell you how many species are dominating the forest in any one place. And similar to the results that we found when we were looking at structural attributes of the forest, we found that park forests are more diverse than their neighboring forests. And this figure is set up slightly different, but the take home is pretty similar in that on the x-axis here, we have the parks, again, arranged by latitude. The y-axis, the zero value, is what you actually want to focus on. Any parks that are plotted above that zero value have a richness or diversity number of species that are higher than their counterparts in the non-Park Service forests. Any triangle that has an asterisk is statistically significant. And again, when we look across the board, most of the parks have more diverse or higher richness values than their counterparts. In fact, 77% of the parks show up as higher, more diverse forests. In this study, we also found that park forests were more even, were less dominated, and included more rare species. And so in sum, these two papers that we published in 2016 and 2018 clearly demonstrate that the Park Service units in the Eastern US play an important role in forest conservation by protecting forests that are more complex and have older forest structure, and they tend to be more diverse than other forests on the landscape. We attribute that to National Park Service land management practices, which typically disallow extractive activities like logging. And this is especially true when you can compare NPS policies to other landowners or managers in this part of the country. And further, because of their structure and diversity, park forests may be resilient to stressors that affect all forests, including the matrix forests. But it certainly doesn't make them immune to those stressors, and that's particularly true for chronic stressors. And so in recent years, our analytical efforts have shifted towards better understanding those challenges, the stressors, and how they influence our forests, and then how managers can take action to promote and maintain the forest diversity, the resilience, and the old forest structure that we have documented occurs in these forests. And this, again, is particularly important given that these are small forests and really, in some cases and in some areas of the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, the only forest in the landscape. Some of the management challenges that we focused on have included deer overabundance, urban development and corresponding forest fragmentation, the introduction and expansion of invasive plants, and then the introduction and expansion of invasive pests and pathogens. And I'll focus on two of those tonight. And the first study I'm going to share is a study published earlier this year, where we looked at regional trends in invasive plant species using the same data sets that were the input for the first two studies documenting structural components and diversity. In this study, we asked how invasive species abundance is changing across eastern forests, and we analyzed the data in a few ways, looking at total invasives, so all invasives together. We also looked at a guild level analysis. So we identified or we assigned invasive species to different life forms, including trees, shrubs and vines represented here by a Japanese barberry, graminoids or grass-like plants like Japanese silkgrass, and then herbaceous plants or forbs like Oriental lady's thumb. We also did species level analyses to identify which were the most widespread species and which were spreading at the fastest rates. And in this first result, I'm just ranking species by how common they were across parks and plots. And Japanese stiltgrass came out as the most widespread species here at the top, present in 33% of plots and 84% of our parks. In fact, this species is present in almost all of the parks except for the northernmost New England parks. And given its rate of spread, it will likely show up there soon. We also found that the shrub and vine guild was quite common in the list of most common species, and I've just highlighted the guild name here. Many of these will be familiar offenders for natural areas in Maryland, including multiflora rose, Japanese honeysuckle, Japanese barberry, and Asian bittersweet, among others. We also found that the shrub and vine guild was the most rapidly expanding among the guilds, so not just the most common, but also the most quickly expanding. And we have plenty of examples in our parks in the National Capital region where we have seen that expansion even within 15 years of monitoring. And I've selected a few photos, paired photos, to show that advance of shrub thickets, but I'll show that at the end of this section. So after ranking species by their commonness, we also looked at how frequency and abundance was changing over time. So not just a snapshot of which species are present in the most sites, but also how those are changing. And I'm going to show one of those results, but they were pretty consistent across metrics and grouping levels. So in this case, we're looking at the percent frequency of all invasive plants in the quadrats of our long-term monitoring plots. So that's what we see on the y-axis, that's percent frequency ranging from 0 to 100. On the x-axis are the cycles. So the first cycle is data collected in 2007 to 2010, and the third cycle is data collected from 2015 to 2018. And when I add the points to this figure, each park will be represented 3 times from the first sample, second sample, and third sample. And we'll draw a line between each of those values. Where the line is increasing, the percent frequency of invasives has increased. Where it looks like it's decreasing, and it has declined. And then where the trend is statistically significant, we have color coded those. So the parks that saw a statistically significant increase are red, and a statistically significant decline are blue. And then adding the parks to the figure, we see that while many parks did not see a significant trend across all invasive plants together, many of them did see a significant increase, some a quite dramatic increase, beginning around 75% quadrat frequency, going all the way up to 100%. So all of the quadrats sampled on the forest floor had at least one invasive species present. There is one significant decline, and since it stands out, and I'm sure folks will ask, that was Prince William Forest Park in Virginia, about an hour south of DC. We also looked at species-specific trends, and that is shown here. This again is a kind of busy plot, but you just want to look at the individual species and basically the balance of where the dots fall on either side of this 0 line. So I'll explain in a little more detail that for each species, the dots and arrow bars around those dots are color coded so that each of the dots representing Japanese silkgrass are yellow, each of the lines and dots representing Alaria or garlic mustard are green. And if the dot is above 0, that is the slope of the modeled distribution over time. So if it's more than 0, it's greater. That species is expanding at the level of that park, within that park. If the dot is below the 0 line, it means that that species is declining at the scale of that park. So for Japanese stiltgrass, we see a pretty high value here for Antietam. Japanese stiltgrass is expanding at Antietam, and it's expanding at many parks. We'll see many parks show up here. The species on this figure are ranked by the number of significant trends. So Japanese stiltgrass had the greatest number of significant trends at the park level, and that was all positive trends. So in all parks where it was significantly changing, it was expanding. It's very common, and it's expanding. And again, when we scan down the species list on the y-axis of this figure, we see many are shrubs and vines. And that's the case for Japanese honeysuckle, for multiflora rose, for wineberry, and Japanese barberry. And as I previously mentioned, this is a pattern that we can clearly see in repeat photography that we take at our monitoring sites. And to get a feel for what this looks like, this is a pair of photographs from a long-term monitoring plot at C&O Canal, where the first photo was taken in 2008, the second photo was taken in 2016, and in the 2008 photo, we clearly see Microcegium or Japanese stiltgrass dominating the forest floor, but by the second photo in 2016, barberry and multiflora rose have moved in, overtaking the Japanese stiltgrass, which is still there just underneath the incoming shrubs. This is another paired photo from C&O where you see the same pattern, 2006 to 2018. Again, Japanese stiltgrass is present in the first photo, and then it's overtaken by multiflora and barberry in the second. Just to show that it's not just C&O, another example from Catoctin Mountain Park, where the exact same pattern is demonstrated, again, in a pretty short period of time. So 2008 to 2020, we see a real increase in barberry, which was present at the beginning of the study, but has expanded substantially. And then finally, this is a pair of photos that is not a time comparison, but these are photos from a plot in National Capital Parks East in DC, where there is a very thick shrub layer that is composed completely of bush honeysuckle, Linacea macii. And the thing I wanted to point out here is that where you have these really thick invasive plant shrub thickets, there's almost no regeneration on the forest floor. And in this case, the only green found on the floor is porcelainberry seedlings. So this plot is almost completely dominated by non-native invasive species. So in sum, we found that invasive species are widespread and increasing in abundance across Eastern parks. 35 of our 39 parks in this analysis had invasives in at least half of their plots. 30 parks had at least one significant increase, whether that was all invasive species combined, species level, or guilds. And the worst invaders were shrubs, vines, and Japanese stiltgrass. And the findings of this study are consistent with a paper we published a few years ago using only data in the National Capital Region parks, where we looked at the presence and change of climbing vines on trees, and then the impacts that these trees have on tree health. And the issue of climbing vines has gained a lot of attention in local media outlets in recent years, including DCS, WAMU, and others, where DC area residents can clearly see the presence of these vine thickets and are often speculating on the impacts that these invasive vines have on our forest resources. And I'll note that in these photos, the species are primarily native vines, but near forest edges, I'm sorry, my slides are advancing without me teaching it. But near forest edges, we see the frequency of exotic vines species increasing. And so in this study we published in 2016, we used our long-term monitoring data to see if climbing vines were in fact becoming more common and what impacts they were having on our trees. And we found that the average number of trees with climbing vines was increasing over the sampling period. and that trees located near a forest edge were more likely to recruit a new vine in between sampling periods. But perhaps more concerning, we found that trees with vines in their crown also had an increased likelihood of mortality. So this is one figure from that paper that shows the interaction of tree location in relation to the edge of the forest, and then the presence of vines in that tree's crown on mortality. In this case, on the x-axis, we have distance to edge, so the location of a single tree. On the left side, where you have the distance to edge is 0, that means the tree is basically on the forest edge. It's right next to some other land cover. On the right side, we have trees that are located in the forest interior. On the y-axis, there's probability of mortality. So at the bottom, mortality is unlikely between sampling events. And at the upper end of this axis, there's an almost 12% chance that a tree will die in between sampling periods. And there are two different lines here because we found that there was an interaction where the pattern for trees that have vines in their crown was different than trees that don't have vines in the crown. Such that if you are a tree located in the forest interior on the right-hand side, you're unlikely to die between sampling events, and having a vine in your crown isn't all that impactful. And that's where most of the native species show up. On the other hand, if you are a tree located near a forest edge, you are more likely to die in between sampling events. You have a much higher mortality rate than interior forest trees. But if you have a vine in the crown, you're almost doubly likely to die in between sampling events, suggesting that trees located near a forest edge exist in a pretty harsh environment, and that is only compounded when there are vines growing on the tree. So the increased risk of mortality that we saw in this paper was particularly problematic for parks and urban areas like DC, because our forested patches tend to be smaller. And so there are more trees on the forest edge since there's just less interior forest. And our thinking there, our takeaway from that was that we need more active vine management near edges in our small urban patches. So taking these two studies together, what are the management implications of this work? Because that's ultimately what we're here to do, to collect data and then to inform how we manage our forests. Well, first, invasive shrubs are increasingly problematic. We've seen that in the data and both their presence and their spread, and just in the photographic evidence of what it looks like under these invasive shrub thickets. They suppress regeneration of our native forbs and trees, which already face threats of climate change and deer overabundance. But that there are also human health consequences, where previous research has suggested that invasive shrubs host more a higher density of ticks, and that there may be a higher incidence of disease in those ticks in the highly invaded habitats. And again, the two papers are consistent in suggesting that invasive vines are also a big problem, particularly in our urban forest patches or in our urban natural areas. And finally, that despite the best efforts of National Park Service staff, weed warrior groups, and other friends groups, invasive plants continue to spread in our natural areas. And we need to expand perhaps the concept of deferred maintenance, which is more typically conceived of as an issue for infrastructure and the built environments, so thinking about roads or visitor centers, but that it extends to our natural resources as well, and that our natural resources require big and sustained capital investments to maintain and improve their ecological value. So we know that they bring that value, we've documented that, and it's important to invest in them to maintain that. And I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about one other natural resource challenge that in some ways is quite similar to managing invasive plants, in that it also requires sustained commitment and sustained action. And that is managing our forests for regeneration in landscapes with high deer densities. And I'm not going to spend too much time on the background information here, but I'll note that none of the parks in the National Capital Region, and none really beyond, have regeneration of small trees, so seedlings and saplings, that is sufficient to achieve the replacement of canopy trees that are currently found in those natural areas. If you want to learn more about how we determine that and how we estimate what is sufficient regeneration, there's a URL listed here. And our network produces these annual summaries of a stocking index, which is a coarse measure for how we're doing in stocking with seedlings and saplings to regenerate and replace canopy trees. So there's plenty of information online that we provide about that. But the status of regeneration is primarily attributed to deer overabundance in this area. And to encourage healthy forest regeneration or sufficient forest regeneration, many of the National Park Service units in the National Capital Region and beyond manage their deer populations, including at Catoctin Mountain Park. And Catoctin was actually the first park in our region to implement deer management. And this is a figure showing deer density estimates through time at the park through 2017, although recent years look similar. Culling at the park began in the winter of 2009. And within a few years, the park attained the densities that the literature suggests will allow for healthy forest regeneration. And to get a feel for what a highly deer impacted forest looks like, here's a typical scene from Catoctin from one of our monitoring plots in 2007, so prior to the culling action at the park. And you can see there is no regeneration on the forest floor whatsoever, no seedlings, no small trees. And there's a very strong browse line. I've added this dotted red line to indicate where that is. And a browse line is basically where you can see that there's no greenery about 2 meters up from the forest floor. It's an area in which the deer have heavily browsed and there's nothing left. This is another scene from the pre-culling time at Catoctin. Again, there is very little forest regeneration in the form of small trees or seedlings. And there are other problems visible here. The grass in the foreground should be familiar by now. That's Japanese stiltgrass. And on the lower right portion is Japanese barberry, one of those quickly invading shrubs that came up in our previous analysis. There are also several dead, standing, and fallen eastern hemlocks, and that's a result of an invasive pest, hemlock woolly adelgid. That's kind of another issue that I won't talk about tonight. So there are almost no signs of forest regeneration in this photo either. Again, no seedlings and very few small trees. It just so happened that when the deer culling began at Catoctin, we had completed our first sample of forest vegetation plots there. So the culling aligned very well with our ability to look at how the forest responded to that management action. And so in a paper published last year, the National Capital Region Network staff set out to answer a few questions about how Catoctin's forests are responding to deer management. And the questions we addressed are here. First, asking, has deer culling led to an increase in native tree seedlings? And then second, has Japanese stiltgrass impeded tree seedling regeneration, given that stiltgrass was already pretty widespread in the park at the time culling began? And so again, in these figures, the take home is at the top. And so if you get lost in any of the details, that's what you need to know. But this figure shows seedling density, basically the number of seedlings we found over time. And that's on the y-axis, it's in seedlings per hectare. And on the x-axis, we have the 3 time periods that we analyzed in this paper. So the first was the complete sample conducted prior to deer management. The second was the sample we conducted while culling was underway. And the third is the second sample we conducted while culling continued. So in this later period, the deer densities were really starting to be closer to that threshold or that target density. And the colored dots here, again, are the mean values for the metric on the y-axis. And we see over time, there was an increase in the total number of seedlings at the park following the deer management. And since the publication of this paper, we've actually almost completed another sample of the park forests and couldn't resist adding that value here to the figure as well. And we see that the pattern has continued. So we continue to see an increase in the seedling density or the number of seedlings in the park, although it appears that that rate of increase may be declining or slowing down over time. And to get an idea of what this increase in seedlings looks like on the forest floor, here again, we have this paired photo comparison of the same plot, where on the left side, there's very little on the forest floor, and the only greenery that you can see is Japanese stiltgrass in the distance. Whereas in the more recent photo, there's much more greenery on the forest floor. Many of those seedlings are white ash, although there's a mix of other things coming up as well. And so we're seeing a response in seedling numbers, and that's really exciting and great. But we also want to know which species are coming back, which species are we seeing in this recruitment layer. And at Catoctin, most of the regeneration, it turns out, is native, which is great, and this figure shows that. But we also are interested in how big those individuals are getting. So this is a figure, again, arranged very similar to the last one, where on the y-axis we have seedlings per hectare, or the number of seedlings we documented. Each panel represents one complete sample of the vegetation. The left panel is prior to deer management. The next two panels are while deer management was underway. The seedlings themselves have been grouped by size classes here. So that first bar in each panel represents seedlings that are 15 to 30 centimeters tall. The second bar is 30 to 45 centimeters tall, and so on. The seedlings have also been color coded by their nativity here. So the blue color is native, the green is exotic. And we see over time that same increase in seedlings. Great. We see that most of them are native, wonderful, and that we're starting to recruit larger individual seedlings, so seedlings that now attain a height of at least 90 centimeters tall. However, I think it's important to point out on this figure that we aren't yet recruiting what might be called a small tree or a sapling. And by definition, in the way we monitor a small tree or a sapling is something that has attained a height of about 2 meters or 200 centimeters. And you'll see that we haven't even started recruiting 100 centimeter tall seedlings yet. So even after about a decade of management, the forest is responding, it's moving in the right direction, but we haven't quite gotten those small trees yet that will be so important for replacing the canopy trees in the park. Another point of interest in the forest response in terms of seedling species is the identity of those species. So not just are they native or exotic, but what species do they represent? And do they represent species that will replace the current canopy trees? So in this figure, the setup is very similar, where our y-axis is seedlings per hectare, the number of seedlings. In this case, I added that most recent sample too, but we've got the pre-management and then 2 complete samples post-management. But we have identified species or grouped species into 3 groups. The first being exotic species, the second being ash, the third being understory species, and these are just shorter woody plants that are unlikely to replace current canopy trees. And the fourth group being overstory, so what we typically think of as our canopy dominants like oak, ash, hickory. And here we see again that overall increase in seedling density over time, but that a big part of that increase and a big part of that response is ash and white ash, primarily at Catoctin. And as many of us know, that's problematic long-term, because those ash may be unlikely to recruit into the canopy because of the impacts of emerald ash borer, an exotic pest that has devastated ash in our part of the world and is quickly moving south. We do see an increase even in the overstory trees over time, and actually a pretty substantial increase since in the most recent samples, so that's good news. But that the overall increase in seedlings is more modest than it might appear on initial look if we think that ash isn't going to be a canopy replacement tree. And finally, shifting to the second question we looked at in this paper, did the presence of the exotic plants and specifically Japanese stiltgrass limit seedling regeneration and the response of the forest vegetation to the management? On this figure, the y-axis again is seedlings per plot, so it's a slightly different unit, but the general idea is the same, that the higher value means more seedlings, the lower value means fewer seedlings. The x-axis here is the percent cover, or the amount of Japanese stiltgrass that we found in association with those seedlings. And the Purple line is the first sample, green line is the second sample post deer management, blue line is the green line is the first sample post deer management, the blue line is the second complete sample post deer management. And what we found, somewhat surprisingly actually, is that we find more seedlings where there is more microstegium. So there's actually very few seedlings on this left part of the figure where there isn't much Japanese stiltgrass. And there's much more seedlings found in areas where there is still grass, and that pattern actually increased over time. So as the forest, as we began to document more seedlings, they continued to show up in areas where there was more Japanese stiltgrass, suggesting that the stiltgrass is not suppressing regeneration. There may be a few explanations for this pattern. One, simply that seedlings show up in the same area that microstegium does for the same underlying reason. Maybe it's just really fertile soils, or it could be something more complex. There's been a suggestion in other papers that thick forest forbs and graminoids can actually hide small seedlings from deer browse. So it may be possible that the seedlings are able to recover and to grow larger, and more of them to grow in places where there's microstegium, because there's this hiding effect and the deer can't browse as many of the seedlings. And so what are the take homes and implications of this study? First, that we believe deer management is working. We're seeing a response to the vegetation. That's a great thing, so that we can maintain the health of these forests, but that we need to recognize that the rate of recovery may be slow, and that's really relative. What's slow, what's fast, but that it'll take probably a few decades to really start paying dividends and seeing small trees and eventually recruiting new trees into the canopy. And that the amount of regeneration isn't the only assessment point. So we're starting to think more about, are we seeing the regeneration of the species we want, the canopy replacements, not just the number of seedlings in each successive sample. And then finally, if we're not seeing the species represented in that regeneration, the species we want to see, we may need to consider additional management actions. And we're at a point now where other parks in the National Capital Region and in other networks have been implementing deer management long enough that we can start to see how the vegetation is responding there. And that will likely inform how we continue managing in other parks moving forward. And so to wrap up, I'll just kind of touch on what I think is the big take home here, and that managing chronic stressors in our parks, things like invasive species, deer, and climate change around the bend, requires long-term sustained commitments. So it's sustained investment, sustained action, and that our forests do respond to these management, but sometimes the forests respond more slowly than we would like. And so it requires persistence and patience. And in our early studies, we showed that Eastern Park forests protect unique older forest habitat. They have high stand level diversity. And so that investment, that patience, and that persistence is really worth it. It's important that we continue doing that into the future. And I'll say thanks to the many I&M colleagues and field crews that participated in the thinking behind this work, and in the analysis, and in the preparation of slides and figures, and then the collection of data over many years. And I'm happy to take any questions in whatever time we have. And I've got a website and contact information there, and the list of citations and papers if folks want to follow up.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation about this valuable work. There are a number of questions from our audience. Most of them have to do with the actual management by the National Park Service, and I know that you're doing the inventory and monitoring. First, there were a couple of questions about the measurement of biomass. The first one was whether you measured the biomass of invasive plant material as well as native.
Yeah, so I think that question is probably from the basal area figure that was comparing basal area in the parks to the non-park forests. And yes, in that study, I don't believe we distinguished and pulled out the exotic trees there. You may want to, kind of depending upon what your question is. One question might be more about just what is the biomass and what is the carbon sequestration on one forest versus the other, or you might be more interested in function or in habitat and wildlife value, and kind of depending upon what your question is, you might decide whether you include the exotics or not. But I'm fairly certain in that figure, we did include non-native species in those comparisons, those basal area estimates.
And another question about measurement of biomass is, how is the biomass measured and how does it compare with canopy assessment?
So again, the biomass in this case is really basal area, which is a crude estimate of biomass. It's really the cross section of a given unit of area that is covered by woody plant material. And there are better ways to estimate biomass. Some of them will be different. The thing about basal areas is it doesn't differentiate between a forest that has many small trees and a forest that only has a few large trees. They could have the same basal area value in the end, depending upon what that total cross-sectional area is when you add it up for a given unit. So it's coarse.
There were a number of questions about management of deer population. You certainly addressed the effects of the deer culling at Catoctin, but people wanted to know exactly how the National Park Service manages deer population and how does it differ from what's done in the matrix forest?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I don't know the details of the matrix forest because there are so many landowners and land managers. It's not one manager. It's basically anyone other than Park Service. So that the deer management or deer action will vary tremendously in that matrix forest. Even the way the parks implement management varies from park to park, and a lot of that information is available on the specific park websites.
There was a follow-up question about deer, which was, Catoctin National Park does a perfect job controlling deer with 20 per square mile. So does Rock Creek Park. Why does Greenbelt National Park not do a good job? That might be more than you can answer, but was that something that information that would be available on the local parks website? Are those decisions made at the park manager level?
Yeah, and they also require NEPA compliance for parks or groups of parks. And Greenbelt Park is part of National Capital Parks East, which, as I understand, is in the middle of that NEPA process now, considering how they may move forward on deer management in the future.
There were also a number of questions about what the National Park Service is doing to manage invasive plants. Does the Park Service ever organize groups of people to pull them out? One questioner mentioned that there have been controlled burns at Antietam. Was the purpose to control invasives?
Yeah, so what does the Park Service do for invasive plants? A lot of things. And I'll say that's actually why I think the findings of that paper are so striking, because it's not something we work towards, we do. Many of the parks manage weed warrior volunteer groups with their partner agencies. They often have staff that do invasive plant management. We also have a regional strike team, the invasive plant management team, that supports all of the parks in our region with technical skills and on the ground management. So there's a lot of activity related to invasive plant management in parks. And if you're interested in getting your hands dirty, you might pick your local park and reach out to them to get involved. And then was there a second part of that question too, Anne?
The second part was about the controlled burns at Antietam and what was the purpose of those.
Right. Yeah, so the controlled burns at Antietam, invasive plant control was likely one of the factors, but those burns to date have primarily been in open spaces, so not in forests. And so it's also to maintain the open space and to managed for specific groups of plants, native groups of plants, as opposed to what was presently there, and definitely to reduce the woody plant cover.
Someone would like to know where online it's possible to find the map of national park areas throughout the U.S. that was shown at the beginning of your presentation.
So if you're looking for the inventory and monitoring networks, that map, that is available on the inventory and monitoring website. If you were to search National Park Service inventory and monitoring, you would find that map or something very similar. I will also provide some URLs after the presentation that will go out with the recording, and I can provide one there to find that map.
Next question is, do you have any quantitative data for how much of the area in the eastern forests are 800 meters or more from the forest edges? This result relates to your data about edge versus interior.
That's a really good question. So you could certainly do that analysis. We haven't done it for, well, actually I take that back. We have an ongoing project now that is probably, that one of the outcomes will be quantifying that for the National Park Service forests in this area. Many state agencies have done something similar, including Virginia, identifying what is referred to as core forests. So the stuff that isn't forest edge, you know, what's far enough away from the edge or in a big enough patch to be considered core. So I don't have a value to report for that, but that's definitely work that is either completed at the state level. Maryland may also be doing that for its forest fragments for parks and non-parks, but the Park Service is also doing that for our own forests here in the DC area.
Next, there's a question about the mortality of trees that have vines in their crown. The questioner wonders whether this is not linked to native versus non-native vines and cites the example of porcelain berry wanting to hog the light, while native grapes can coexist with trees for a long time.
Yeah, I think it probably is. In the study that we published looking at patterns of vine abundance, vine change, and the effects on trees, we didn't have enough data at the time to distinguish the impacts, the mortality impacts on individual trees. But given that invasive vines are spreading more at forest edges, it would not be surprising that that's where you're seeing that impact that you're seeing on trees is primarily due to invasive plants at forest edges, invasive vines.
Questions, there are a number of questions about National Park Service management of non-native invasives. Two concerning biocontrols. Has there been any use of biocontrols for emerald ash borer or for Japanese knotweed? Another person asked for an update on the emerald ash borer.
Yeah, so there are biocontrols, as far as I understand, for both of those pests. Parks in our area have not participated, to my knowledge, in the release of those biocontrols, but they have been released in this area, in the DC, in the greater DC area. My understanding is the emerald ash borer biocontrols, for example, were released at some sites in the district. And those in many cases are close to National Park Service lands and likely move into national park forests. Update on emerald ash borer is that we continue to see dramatic losses and mortality of ash, all ash species in our area. And at this point, most ash we find in our long-term monitoring plots are dead, and we're now transitioning more into from the standing dead tree status to fallen trees. And you know, one of the concerns is both the falling trees. and the opening of the forest canopy, which may be a conduit for expansion of invasive plants.
Does the National Park Service utilize drones for analysis of any of the data points?
No, not at the moment. And my understanding is that drones are not allowed at all in National Park Service units as of now.
There are several questions about delayed or deferred maintenance in the national parks. The first one is whether that's making the problem of non-native invasives worse as they increase in the seed bank.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it. I think, that's the whole point of thinking about deferred maintenance for natural resources, in addition to the human-built landscape. I think we already think about that a lot in terms of our roads and our visitor centers. We haven't put the money in or the investment in that we need to, and that concept should be expanded to include the investment of natural resources for that point, that if we don't invest now, the cost later is larger, right? So yeah, I agree. That's it.
Well, another person asked whether the problem of deferred maintenance is being addressed in the future.
Other than it's something I think we all acknowledge and talk about, and I think many land managers and biologists and natural resource managers in the Park Service are committed to that. I don't have a concrete answer of how that is being addressed right now, other than us pursuing that as a path and considering ways to bring more investment to natural resource management.
Okay, thank you. A number of people are curious about and interested in climate change. Is the Park Service trying to anticipate which tree species might better survive with warming? Have you seen or quantified shifts in the types of trees in the plots that you consider to be due to climate change? Also, are there any studies being done, comparative studies, with the areas south of us, like North Carolina, to see what may be coming? So there's a lot there.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I'll try to touch on at least a few of those. In that, yes, we are trying to anticipate climate change impacts and position ourselves to be ready to respond to those. We are looking for those changes in our data. Trees are long-lived organisms. We are not seeing currently changes in distribution or species assemblages among trees that we can attribute to climate change that has happened since we have begun monitoring. That's partly just because of the lifespan of the organism, and that our forests experience a variety of stressors to which you could attribute the change we're seeing. I think the more impactful changes that we've seen in the last decade are attributed to invasive pests and pathogens more than anything else we've seen, and then probably also landscape change. So the experience of a tree being near a forest edge or in a forest interior. That's not to say that climate change won't be impacting us moving forward, or hasn't already begun to do that, maybe even in smaller size classes, seedlings and saplings. And in fact, we do have a colleague, Kate Miller, who is the lead author on many of these studies, who works for the Northeast Temperate Network, who has done some work with modeling and looking at how the species that are current dominants in California may move more farther north into some of our parks in New England. And one of the big challenges is not so much species tolerance, but species abilities to move across the landscape. And she's actually identified a region in and around DC and Baltimore that's kind of like this block towards species migration because of regeneration challenges in this part of the country.
One more topic that gave rise to several questions that I would like to ask you, Liz, and that was about the non-native invasives on forest edges. People wondered, what is the best way to control the non-native invasive vines on forest edges? Do you think that greater population in those areas is contributing to the problem, and whether there are any programs to educate property owners adjacent to parks to eliminate invasive species to protect the edge habitat?
Yeah, so the challenge of invasive plants near edge habitat is a big one, because the conditions of the edge habitat are conducive to invasive plant establishment and growth. There are typically areas of high light. They typically are close to dispersal corridors, like roads or rivers. And so there's likely always to be that pressure and always going to be invasive plants showing up near forest edges, which means that it again falls in this bin of like requiring consistent commitment, action, management, and it's not an easy fix. And so part of the solution certainly has to be awareness and public education. And many of our parks and park partners do that work. And as I had mentioned early on, there has been a lot of media coverage in this area about the problem of invasive plants, particularly on the edges of natural areas recently. And I think that can be really helpful to raise awareness and then point people to the resources they need to learn more and then to take action. A big part of it is taking action on your own property, as you pointed out, and the neighbors of parks, but it also has to happen in the parks, and that has to happen through approved, condoned, and trained weed warrior groups.
One more question, and that is whether there are any citizen science programs in forest management that can assist your efforts.
Yeah, that's a good one. There are many citizen science programs. For the data set we collect, there is not a citizen science data stream. So that doesn't get incorporated into the data we collect about the structure and diversity of the forests. But citizen science data can be really informative in determining where to manage invasive plants on the landscape. And so the Maiden app, it represents many of the parks in this area, iNaturalist, even the Maryland Biodiversity Project, all of those groups that collate citizen observations of location, species identity, and then have evidence associated with them, photos. All of that can be applied in the parks and in other natural areas to determine where we take management action, primarily invasive plant management. So I'd suggest looking into those if you want to get involved and look at citizen science programs and ways to contribute.
Thank you very much, Liz, for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Anne.